Here we have 8 of the latest and, in some cases, greatest Enduro forks for the 2021 model year. These are designed to take on the most challenging terrain that you'll come across on a single crown bike. In this video, I'm going to go through what I think of them, how they all perform, and how they compare relative to one another. So keep watching to the end to know which I think performs best. So this year, the forks we have on test are the Manitou Mezzer Pro, the Intend Ebonite, the SR Suntour Durolux 36 EQ R2C2, the Marzocchi Z1 Coil, the RockShox Lyrik Ultimate, the RockShox Zeb Ultimate, the Fox 36 Factory, and the Fox 38 Factory. So before you turn caps lock on and ask me why I haven't tested your favorite fork, we did test 10 different forks last year, so we'll put a link to that video down in the description. I've tested all forks in 170mm travel and 29-inch wheel size on the same bike, and I used the same tire pressures and bike setup, shock setup throughout testing. For setup, I started with the manufacturer's recommended settings for my weight, but pretty quickly started to adjust the air pressure and the volume spacers to try and get them feeling similarly supportive. One of the best ways to do this, I found, is to push down on the fork as hard as I physically can on flat ground and measure how much travel I can get out of them. I find I can do this very consistently, and so it's a good way of measuring how firm the fork is, particularly towards the end of its travel, and then I can set the forks up to be fairly similar as a baseline. From then I started riding the forks individually and adjusting things like the air pressure, volume spacers, compression and rebound damping to try and get the forks performing at their best for the terrain in question. I then set about testing them all back to back on the same few tracks which have a really good mix of terrain. I really can't emphasize enough that it's only when you test the forks on the same day, on the same track, as close together in time as possible, that you really can hone in on the differences between them. So let's get into it. First off is the Manitou Mezzer Pro. The Mezzer is very controlled and supportive. The 3-chambered air spring means there's plenty to hold you up in the middle of the travel without it being too firm at the start or the end of the stroke. So for slow, steep, kind of trialsy terrain, it's really confidence inspiring. But when you're rattling across high frequency bumps, sort of braking bumps or just matted route sections, I think it's overdamped, especially on rebound. So even when set fully open on rebound, it packs down slightly on those high frequency bumps. And so it becomes harsh, harsher than all the other forks on test, no matter what I did to the rebound, compression and air spring. In fact, dropping the air pressure to try and get more sensitivity actually made the problem worse. So I think this is definitely a problem with the rebound, something that Manitou could maybe fix in future. But for now, I think it's just too harsh on those kind of really high frequency sort of bike park style trails. Next up is the Intend Ebonite. This is a really niche and boutique fork made by a guy in Germany called Cornelius Kapfinger. It's got lots of interesting little details, like the lowers are CNC machined out of aluminium instead of cast out of magnesium, and then the arch is bonded on afterwards. However, when you're rattling across rough sections off the brakes, it's prone to top out slightly, even though the rebound isn't overly fast. And because the beginning stroke isn't that soft, it doesn't feel as sort of stuck to the trail and as ground hugging as the best forks on test. I did find that by setting the air pressure with the fork partially compressed, that would over-pressurize the negative spring such that the fork would sit more easily into its beginning stroke and give you more traction, and it wouldn't top out either. But after a while, the spring resets, so you have to do that again. And even when set up like this, when you're slamming into larger bumps, it's a bit more harsh and wayward than some of the best forks on test, and a little bit harder to stay on line in a kind of really rough pitted berm, for example. I did try the lighter high-speed compression tune, which is a separate valve available from Intend, which is quite easy to fit, but this didn't really solve the problem. I think that it's flexing and binding on these kind of big cornering and bump loads, and I think that's the problem, but it's hard to say for sure. Don't get me wrong, most of the time it performs really well, so if you want something really interesting and boutique, it's worth a look. But on those rare occasions, I really think it doesn't perform quite as well as the more mainstream brands. Next up is the snappily titled SR Suntour Durolux 36 EQ R2C2, which happens to be the cheapest fork on test. So the EQ stands for self-equalizing air spring, which is a new feature for this year. It works a lot better for a much broader range of riders than the old Coil negative spring in the older forks. It has high and low speed compression and high and low speed rebound damping, which is something you typically only find at the very top end. So it's interesting to see that at such a low price point. It's also got bleed ports just under the seals, which allow you to top up the lubricating oil in the foam O-rings in between services, which I think is a really nice feature. And on the trail, the sensitivity is very good, particularly when faced with larger bumps. It really soaks them up, it never spikes or feels harsh. And this is a criticism we had of the similarly priced RockShox Yari that we tested last year. So fatigue and hand pain on long, rough descents is very good indeed. However, that self-equalizing spring has quite a small volume to the negative spring, and this makes it have what I would describe as a kind of old school air spring feel. So it's quite firm in the beginning of the travel relative to how it is in the middle of the stroke. So this means it doesn't hold itself up very well when you're kind of hard on the brakes or riding steep terrain. So you have to use a lot of compression damping, which helps in some cases. You also have to increase the air pressure and just put up with not having as much sag. And this really compromises that beginning stroke sensitivity. So it's kind of a catch-22 between off the top sensitivity and traction versus mid-stroke support. And while the damping and kind of comfort is very impressive, I think on balance I'd still have the Yari because its air spring gives you more traction and more support later in the stroke. And you can always upgrade the damper in the Yari, whereas with this, you're kind of stuck with the fork as it is. So next up is the Marzocchi Z1 Coil. So we tested the Marzocchi Z1 Air last year, and the most important thing I learned from the comments on the video was that it's pronounced Marzocchi, not Marzocchi, so thanks for that. The second most important thing I learned about it is that, a bit like the SR Suntour that we just talked about, the air spring was quite firm at the start and a bit soft in the middle of the stroke, whereas this Coil version is completely the opposite. It has incredible kind of off-the-top sensitivity, so it really feels sort of stuck to the trail, really good traction and kind of that ground-hugging feel. But when you're hard on the brakes, it stays up in its travel probably better than anything else here, to be honest. So you can kind of have your cake and eat it too in terms of traction and support at the same time. Despite being fairly simple, the performance of the grip damper in this fork leaves very little to be desired. However, the problem with this fork is partly that it's quite heavy, it's the heaviest fork on test, but for me the main issue is that there's only 4 available spring rates to suit anyone from sort of 50 kilos to well over 100 kilos of body weight. And that means that the gaps between them are really big, sort of 20% jumps between spring rates. That means that a lot of people, myself included really, are going to fall between ideal spring rates. So you'll have to either have one that's a bit too stiff or a bit too soft. And it certainly means that kind of fine-tuning this spring rate for differences in terrain, for example, is out of the question. If you're worried about putting on a dad bod like I am, that could be a bit of an issue as well. As you may have noticed, I am being absolutely blinded by the sun now, so we're going to move around slightly. Now that horrendous continuity error is out of the way, my retinas have been saved, so we'll move on to the next fork, which is the RockShox Lyrik Ultimate. The Lyrik won our group test last year, and it's still a fantastic fork. It's really easy to set up, it's very comfortable and supple, great for kind of long, tiring descents. The range of adjustment is really usable and really ample. It's also very red. However, RockShox have made a little update to the air spring for 2021, and I really don't think it's an improvement. So what they've done is they've moved the transfer port, which is the point in the travel at which the positive and the negative air springs equalize. They've moved that to the top of the stroke such that the pressures are equalized right at the top of the stroke. This allows the fork to extend more fully, so you get every millimeter of advertised travel. It also makes the fork easier to set up because you just inflate the air spring and you're done. You don't need to compress the fork slightly to equalize the positive and negative chambers and then reset your pressures again. So this new air spring makes it not quite as supple at the start of the stroke, That means it loses just a little bit of that off-the-top sensitivity and sort of ground-hugging, high traction feel that we liked about the old fork. And certainly compared to the new Fox 36, which has been updated this year, I think it's really lost ground, and it doesn't have the same composure and traction that the 36 does now. Also, if you run the rebound quite fast, it will top out just very subtly. It's a bit like the problem I mentioned with the Intend fork, but to a smaller extent. Don't get me wrong, it's still a really good fork, and if you test it in isolation, it's quite hard to tell the difference, I think, between this one and the old model. But when you ride it back to back, especially with the new 36, it's just not quite as ground hugging, not quite as predictable and as sensitive. So I think, yeah, the Lyrik has really been leapfrogged by the Fox forks this year. Next up is the RockShox Zeb, which I had assumed was named after me, but with a typo. But apparently it's named after Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, after whom the Pikes Peak Mountain and the RockShox Pike are also named. The Zeb has 38mm stanchions, making it stiffer than the Lyrik. It's also got more bushing overlap, so the points at which the upper tubes and the lower tubes contact one another are further apart. And I think that's possibly the main difference. What I noticed on the trail is that when you're slamming into sort of shoebox-sized rocks, there's less drama and there's less force transmitted to the handlebar. The fork just seems to deal with those larger bumps better. And I didn't notice any downside to the extra stiffness. I didn't notice any extra harshness. I think this is because when a fork flexes, it's flexing in a direction which is almost 90 degrees to the direction you want it to move. So I don't think that there's any benefit to a flexier fork. Obviously there is a downside in terms of weight. There's a weight penalty to this over the Lyrik, so which is best for you will depend on how you prioritize weight. But in terms of suspension performance, I really think there's no downside to these burlier forks. The only criticism I have of the Zeb is the same as with the Lyrik, that it has the similar air spring design, so it's not quite as supple in the very beginning of the stroke, and nor does it have the same sort of mid-stroke support as you get from the Fox 38. And I did a whole video comparing the Zeb and the 38, so you can go into way more detail on that. We'll put a link to that down in the description too. But to sum up, the Zeb just doesn't have quite the same level of traction when you're off the brakes, nor does it have quite the same level of support when you're hard on the brakes. Next up is the Fox 36. So Fox has consigned the 36 to 150 and 160mm travel this year. So I actually had to use an aftermarket 170mm air spring to compare it to the others. But don't think that the 36 has become less capable. In fact, quite the reverse. In fact, Fox claims that the 36 is slightly stiffer than last year's model, but the main difference you'll notice is that the air spring has been massively improved. So it's got much more volume in both the positive and negative chambers, and that means you get a more linear, coil-like air spring. So it's noticeably suppler and softer at the start of the stroke, whilst having more support in the middle of the travel. So as I already alluded to when comparing it to the Lyrik, that soft beginning stroke means it feels just that bit more sort of stuck to the trail, and the front wheel just seems to grip that bit better, especially when you're riding over rattly, sort of rough terrain off the brakes. But at the same time, there's plenty of support when you're deeper in the stroke. So when you're holding on the brakes, the geometry is reasonably well conserved. And yet, when you hit something very hard, you can still use all the travel, which I think is quite unusual for an air spring, that you can feel like you have plenty of support in the middle of the travel under brakes, and yet you can still access all the travel without it feeling just too soft. I've been running the compression damping pretty close to open. It's actually totally usable now, even with the compression adjustments completely closed. But I think because that air spring gives you a bit more support, I don't think you need quite as much compression damping. On the rebound side, I'm almost fully open as well, and some of my lighter colleagues say they're already fully open on rebound, so I think it could do with a bit more range, adjustment range in that direction. And I certainly think the recommended settings are just too slow. That brings us to the fork that I think performs the best on test, and that's the Fox 38. It has a lot of the same features as the 36, so I won't go through them all again. But just like when comparing the Zeb to the Lyrik, I think the 38 just offers a bit more composure in those kind of really kind of big, heavy hitting sections of trail. A bit less feedback and no real downsides. I'm still not sure if the extra stiffness really helps that much in the corners. There have been times in sort of really high load cornering situations where I felt like it feels a bit more direct, but without being able to do a blind test, I'm not really sure if that's just in my head or if that's a real effect. Certainly when it comes to tackling really rough sections of trail, I think it just has the edge on kind of everything else here really. And as I explained in great detail in that Zeb versus 38 video, it has a bit of an edge in terms of sensitivity and traction, and also in terms of support and predictability when compared to the Zeb. It is very expensive at about £1,300. It's also one of the heaviest forks here too, so it isn't going to be for everyone. Remember that the 36 is still a very good fork, so if you're more concerned about weight, that may be the one for you. But in terms of outright suspension performance, the 38 is the best fork on test here. So that concludes this year's Forks Group test. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think, particularly if you've got any direct experience with any of these forks. Let us know how you get on with them, and particularly let us know if you've found any kind of reliability issues. Have they started creaking? Have they snapped in half? Do let us know in the comments, that'd be very interesting to know. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that little bell icon so you'll get a notification every time we upload a new video. Thanks very much for watching.